Hello, everybody, and I am sorry for being just a couple of minutes late. We were dealing with a couple of technical difficulties here in our studio. My name is Julie Williamson. I'm the Chief Growth Enabler at Karrikins Group, and I'm joined here today by many of my colleagues as well around the world. I would welcome everybody to join in the chat as we go through these 7 signs of misalignment that we're going to talk about in the next 30 minutes. This is going to go really quick, and we're going to have a lot of fun. So thank you so much for joining me. And again, apologies for being a little bit late. I'm going to ask folks, I'm going to look over here in the chat and just ask folks if you can give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, because we've been dealing with a couple of sound technical difficulties here in the studio. Any of you who've ever done any recording, I'm sure can appreciate that challenge. So I'm getting a couple of thumbs up. That's great. Thank you so much. I know our sound isn't going to be as good as we like it to be on this particular webinar, but we're just going to roll with it. And we're going to have some fun anyway. So thank you all for joining us. Again, I appreciate it. And we're here to talk about 7 signs of misalignment that we see all over the world in companies, large and small, partner-led, corporate companies, entrepreneurs, startups, all kinds of companies. We see these 7 signs of misalignment. And we at Karrikins Group think it is so important to be able to identify these early, because they're like the canaries in the coal mine. They tell you when things might not be heading in exactly the direction that you want to head in. So let's dive in. When we think about the 7 signs of misalignment, we think about them around this circumflex. And we ask people to consider, do you see this sign rarely? Do you see it typically? Or do you just see it sometimes, kind of in the middle? Now, my colleague Nicole is going to post in the chat a link to this circumflex for you so that you can download it. I know it's a little bit hard to read because it's small around the circumflex, but we're going to go through each of these in detail over the next 30 minutes or so. So you can click on the link, you can download it, and when you download it, you're going to find also that there's a blank version of it. And this is a great tool for you to use to have conversations with your colleagues as you're thinking about, is this a sign that we see often in our organization or on our team? Is this something that maybe we want to lean into and work with a little bit differently as we get going on getting into alignment on our most ambitious goals and our biggest strategies, our most important transformations? Each of these signs is something that you can identify for yourself with your team or with your organization. So let's take a look at each of these 7 signs. We're going to go through, like I said, in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, I would just love to hear from each of you. And if you could just pop it in the chat and maybe make sure that your chat is set to everyone and not just to panelists and hosts. Sometimes that's a default for people. But just pop in the chat. Of these 7 signs of misalignment, which one just jumps out at you? You can put the number in, you can put a description, whatever might work. But just pop in the chat. Which of these do you think, yep, that's us. We've got that sign in our organization. And let's just see which one is the most common across this group here that we have today. And so I see a few people coming in, number 1 and number 5, Heather. I see that. Yeah, meetings are on repeat and everybody's status is green. Those two often go together. I see a lot of number 2s. We hear a lot about decision rights. Yep, that's a really common one. Number 7, yep, Daniel, we see that quite a bit. Jim, 3, 5, and 7. Yeah, actually 3, 5, and 7 are also ones that are a bit interlinked. Derek, I see number 2 coming in with decision rights are unclear and decision making is slow. See quite a few number 2s. Gerald, I see 1, 2, and 6. Yep. So again, it's typical that these go together. They kind of bundle a little bit. And so that's one of the really interesting things is that these are interrelated and combined, they can lead to misalignment across your organization. Now at Karrikins Group, we know that alignment helps people accelerate towards their goals, and misalignment really slows things down, particularly in times of transformation or when you have something ambitious on the horizon. If you think about it, one of the most ambitious things that we've done in the United States is put a man on the moon. And I think we all know that if they had been off by just a few degrees on their trajectory, they wouldn't have reached it. So tiny little elements of misalignment can really impact the ability to reach your goal. Keep that in mind. All right, let's take a look at each of these in a little bit more detail. The first one is this idea that meeting topics are on repeat. Has anybody ever sat in a meeting and just want to like stick pins in your eyes because it's so frustrating to be listening to the same conversation over and over again? Just by a show of hands, curious if anybody has that going on for them. You know, we struggle with this at Karrikins Group too. It doesn't take a big, complicated company to have a situation where meetings are on repeat. Here's why we consider that to be a sign of misalignment. When meetings are on repeat, it means that you're in deeply habituated conversations, and deeply habituated conversations stop you from going into dangerous territory, having conversations that maybe nobody wants to have because it's uncomfortable or scary, or it represents a threat or a challenge in the organization. So instead, we just stay in these comfortable spaces. It's kind of like, you know, when if your partner comes home and they walk in the door and you have the same conversation every single time after work. How was your day? Fine. Anything exciting happen? No. What's the weather like? You know, you kind of are in these very comfortable spaces that you know aren't threatening or challenging, but they also don't get to the heart of the matter. So meetings being on repeat, huge sign of misalignment for us. It's also one of the easier ones to address. A really simple thing that I would offer to you for those of you who had number one out in the chat is that you can simply change up the agenda for the meeting. Sometimes just changing the order in which you talk about things can really change the level and the depth of the conversation that you get into, because it breaks the habit just a little bit. There's other deeper work that needs to be done often, but that's just something simple that you can take away and try today if you want to with your team. Let's take a look at number two. Number two is decision rights are unclear and decision making is slow. Maybe just pop in the chat. Is that for you a rarely, sometimes, or a typically seen sign of misalignment, or a sign for you? Is that something that happens in your organization? Just pop in the chat. And Heather, I see you say to constantly revisit decisions or conversations that have already been made. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a minute too. That's this idea of decision rights are unclear, decision making is slow. I see, Rachel, you're saying often, and Jim, rarely. That's great. I love that. Decision-making velocity is something that we often are working with teams on in the work that we do around alignment. And what happens in organizations sometimes is we'll walk in and people will tell us, do you know what? Everybody around here can say no, but nobody's willing to say yes. Because yes represents an investment or taking a risk or doing something a little different. So it might be that the decisions are being made, but they're being made to stay in the status quo or to continue with business as usual, and not really leaning into that opportunity to be innovative or to be risk-taking or to try different things or to speculate, like what might be possible. People wait until the data tells them that the decision is correct. But as we know, action often precedes clarity. And I'll say that again, because this is what gets in the way of decisions. Action precedes clarity. Sometimes you have to take a step forward in order to discover and learn and adjust along the way. And it's those adjustments, that's where alignment really happens. It's how do we continually adjust to get where we want to go? All right, let's take a look at number three. Number three is discussions and decisions happen outside of the meeting and not in them. And Heather, I think this sometimes is part of that revisiting decisions. Here's what happens is somebody will prime the key decision makers before the meeting so that they have all of the information that they have and they can make the decision quickly in the meeting itself with all of the people who need to align to that particular decision or direction. Or you have a great conversation, or maybe a not so great conversation, maybe a very difficult conversation with a group of people, and they think a decision has been made, but then somebody goes out and buttonholes the decision maker and revisits and relitigates the decision outside of the meeting. When you have that happening, what it does is it breaks down the ability of the people, the broader group of people, to engage in the discussion and dialogue that drives alignment. Now, I'm all for priming key decision makers before a meeting so that they have the depth and understanding that they need to participate in the discussion and get to a decision in a meeting. Sometimes experts need a little more time to be able to get deeper into the data or to better understand the situation. And that gives them what they need in the meeting to hold the space for the right conversation. But if that's being done to circumvent or shortcut the conversation, then you run the risk of misalignment. And the same thing on the back end, if decisions are getting relitigated afterwards, then people feel like their contributions in the meeting were not appreciated or respected or understood. And that actually leads us directly to side number 4, which is that interdependencies and broader impacts aren't understood or well managed. What I mean by this is in many large organizations, and quite frankly, in small organizations too, it's very important for decision makers to be able to connect the dots for people across their organization to say, hey, we're going to make this decision. And when we make this decision, we know it's going to be a challenge for people over here. It's going to cause more work. It's going to create new issues. It's going to do whatever it's going to do. It's like whack-a-mole, right? Something else is going to pop up with every decision that we make. And if those interdependencies aren't articulated and clarified by the people making the decisions, then you wind up with people sort of sitting back and saying, you know what? Those leaders, those decision makers, they're totally disconnected. They have no idea what the impact is of that decision. Here's a classic example of that, by the way. It happens in sales and delivery. Anybody ever heard the expression, don't confuse sales with delivery? Just a big heads up around that one. We see a lot of that in our organization. So when a salesperson goes out, we work in B2B. I think a lot of people on this call do as well. When a salesperson goes out and sells something, and they make it highly custom in order to get the sale, and then the VP of sales approves that customization, the people over in delivery are saying, well, that person has no idea how much work that's going to create. That's going to totally erode our margins. We're not going to be able to support it in the long term. We're not going to be able to hit the dates. There's all of these interdependencies that have to be respected, but the decision was made to go ahead and approve that sale. So that kind of appreciation, if the VP of sales would even just say to the delivery people, hey, I know this is going to create a problem for you. Here's why I'm making this decision. And if they can connect the dots and help people to understand those interdependencies, it's amazing how much people will align to do the hard work to make things happen. But when they feel like their needs or their impacts aren't appreciated by the decision makers, they don't get into alignment with the decision and the direction that's being asked for. So again, if you're circumventing the conversation by either priming decision makers or buttonholing them afterwards, and you don't have the conversation in the meeting, sign number 3, then we wind up with sign number 4, which is that people feel like interdependencies and the ripple effect isn't really fully appreciated. Just curious in the chat if anybody has that coming up for them in their organization. And I'm just going to scroll down a little bit here so that I can see that. All right, great. So I'm going to go on to number 5. And Miriam, I see you're saying, yes, you see that in your organization. Thanks for that. Again, it's very common. And by the way, all of these things, these are very common. If you feel like you have these issues, don't worry, you're not alone. But like I said, at Karrikins Group, we're a small company. We have these challenges too, but we have to keep an eye out for them. And just by talking about them and making them visible, we can really start to shape how we show up in that space. All right, let's take a look at sign number 5. Sign number 5, everyone's status is green, but we aren't keeping up. Now, I know a few people said number 5 is something that you see in your organizations. I'll just ask you again to say whether this is something that you see rarely, sometimes, or typically in your organization. Maybe pop that in the chat. And let's just get a temperature across the group, how often we see this particular one happening. Give you just a second to pop that in the chat. And I see Jim saying often, especially since I'm a CPA and it's busy season. Yeah. It's funny how when there's pressure on capacity, we see this happening even more. Brent says it depends on the leader. It's a seasonal issue for sure. Michelle says, yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, this is something that, again, the canary in the coal mine, right? When everybody's status is green, but you feel like you're not making traction, you're not gaining on strategic priorities or transformation that you know needs to happen, or maybe you're losing market share even, right? But everybody's doing great. Everybody's showing up at the quarterly business reviews, at the weekly status meetings with green status. And yet, organizationally, we're not getting there. The best analogy for this is a sports analogy. Imagine in basketball, you've got 5 players out on the court, and they're all doing just fine. They're all in green. But for some reason, they're losing the game. Why? Because they're not passing effectively. They're not blocking for each other. They're not doing what they need to do collectively as a group to win the game. And that's the same thing that happens in business. We all go off and do our own areas just fine, but we miss the interconnections. And so it ties back to that number 4, interdependencies aren't well understood. What's the opportunity that sits between us? What's the risk that sits between us in the organization? And how do we have those conversations, which, by the way, loops us back all the way to number 1. Meetings and conversations are deeply habituated and they're on repeat. So we're not really talking about what's going on between us. And that means that everybody can be in green. Everybody can be doing just fine, but you're not gaining ground on the things that are most important to you and your team. So this is one that we look for really closely when we get into organizations and start working with them on alignment, because this is an absolute sign that there might be deeper issues that need to be unpacked. It also points to people wanting to manage upward. They want to be able to show up as green and not have difficult conversations with people about what's happening in their organization. They might be yellow or red, to use the traditional measures there, because there's something going on in other parts of the organization that are impacting them. But they want to show up as leaders who have everything under control. And what that does is it dials down conversation, and it means that you miss opportunities to talk about what's happening across the organization. I have this on the slide: what gets measured gets manipulated. I absolutely believe that people are great. We like to say what gets measured gets done, but in fact, it is really easy to manipulate most KPIs, OKRs, MOPs, whatever you want to call them, and show up with that green status. By the way, in my 30 plus years in business, I'm sure I've manipulated my share of KPIs. This is not an unusual thing. People do it all the time. We do it for really good reasons. We do it because we want to get in and out unscathed. I hear people say that, right? Well, I don't want to get burned in the meeting, so I can't tell people what's really going on. So there's all sorts of good reasons why people might manipulate data to make sure that they can show up in a green status. And again, I've probably done it myself, but it is really important to be able to get into the conversations so that you can really drive alignment in different ways. All right, we're into the back half of this and coming down to number 6. Number 6 for me is a really interesting one. Stated priorities are not adequately funded or prioritized or resourced. Curious again, how many people see this in their own organizations, whether it's rarely, sometimes, or typically? And this happens when leaders come out, especially January, February. Here we are halfway through Q1, and there's a big presentation or a big announcement about strategic priorities or transformation or the direction that we're taking as an organization. And when we do that, then the rest of the organization looks around and says, oh, cool, that sounds awesome. Let's do that. That sounds like what we need to do. But here's the thing. When those strategic priorities don't get resourced, and it's not visible to the organization that they're getting resourced, every single person in your organization and on your team has something that is discretionary for them. It might be energy, expertise, resources. It might be budget in some cases, whatever it is. Every single person in your organization has something that is discretionary to them. And if you want all of that discretionary capability and resourcing to get pointed at strategic priorities, people need to know that the leaders who are stating those priorities are funding them and resourcing them. When there's a belief in the organization that strategic priorities are a little bit of an afterthought, or we like to call it a side hustle, or it might just be something that is going to be a nice to have, but really what's most important is business as usual. And really what's most important is delivering on what's right in front of us. They're going to take all of that discretionary access that they have, again, their energy, their focus, their expertise, whatever it might be, and they're going to point it to business as usual. And they're not going to be paying attention to those strategic priorities because they're not seeing them resourced at the most senior levels in the organization. When we go into organizations and we talk with leaders about their strategy and they tell us, oh, we have a 9-point strategy to get into a new market or to retool our technology or whatever it might be, and they walk us through it. And then we go out in the organization and people say, we don't have a strategy, or I've never even heard of that. And then we go back to the leaders and they just lose their minds and they tell us, well, we talked about it at the town hall and we sent out an email and we put up a poster and all of these things. But they're not resourcing those priorities and they're not taking action on them in meaningful ways. And what that means is the rest of the organization is not aligned to contributing what they have as discretionary to those strategic priorities. So this misalignment typically is vertical in an organization, and it's something that we see, again, quite a lot in the work that we do as we help leadership teams get into alignment on their most important strategic priorities. Julie, I see you said always heightened with a recent acquisition. Yeah, by the way, acquisitions drive the need for new strategic priorities. And those strategic priorities might have to change as a result of the acquisition. And it might be that the biggest priority is getting the acquisition up and running within the new organizational structure. But again, people have to see that and understand what that looks like so that they can take their discretionary energy, time, resources and point it towards helping to solve that. So a really interesting one. Thanks, Julie, for that. Rachel, I see your point that this is really closely connected to number 4. It absolutely is. This is very closely connected. And like I said, they're all a little interrelated, but this is one that we see definitely pulling through there. All right, let's take a look at number 7. Number 7, I saw this come up in a number of your earlier reflections as something that you see in your organization. Let's just pop in the chat again. Rarely, sometimes, or typically in your organization do you see this, this sign of misalignment. When we talk about accountability, it's so fascinating to me. This is, I think, the one topic that has come up maybe in every single alignment solution that we've delivered over the last, I don't know how many years. But the issue of accountability across a team or across a senior leadership team, or even internally within like an operations team or something, it comes up regularly as a sore spot for people on the team. But the challenge that we have is it comes up like this. Oh, you know, the leader needs to hold people accountable to doing what they say they're going to do. Or people need to be more accountable to their measures. So by the way, that everybody's green, but we're not getting anywhere. That's because people aren't holding themselves accountable to the metrics that they've set up for themselves, right? So we see this beaming through all of the other signs of misalignment. And I see, Rachel, you're saying it's uneven across the organization. And Jen, you're saying you see that often. Yeah, accountability is really a sticky subject for a lot of people. It's something that we don't define very well. So I would suggest to you that if there's a sense in your organization, and again, use the template that you can download from our PDF, if there's a sense in your organization that accountability is a sore spot, then you need to get to the mindsets and the group dynamics that drive accountability and understand how people define it. What does accountability look like? What does it sound like? What would a more accountable team be doing differently? By the way, number 1, what different conversations would we be having if we were holding each other accountable? It takes courage to hold yourself and to hold others accountable to things, especially that might be a little out of your control. And so as you step into that space, people have to really shift their mindset about what it means to be a part of this team and to come in and have real, authentic conversations about what's going on organizationally and out in the market. So I see Heather Ann, you say often, and the hesitancy to take ownership. That's right. Accountability requires the courage to take ownership of delivering results. And maybe not all of the conditions around those results are in your control. And that's really where the rub is with accountability, right? People only want to be held accountable to things they have full control over. But that's not how business works, especially in a highly interconnected, complex environment with a lot of moving parts. There's going to be dependencies across the board. All right, we're coming down to the bottom of the hour, and we've made our way through all 7 of these signs of misalignment. I just want to take a few minutes and round out on them, because what I really want to help you to think about is to not be the team that does everything right and still fails. Now, probably the most current example that we have of that in terms of case studies is Nokia and the mobile phone unit that they had. Does anybody on this call today have a Nokia phone? Let me just see a show of hands if there's anyone that has a Nokia phone. No, I don't think so. If somebody did raise their hand, I missed it. But a Nokia phone, let's talk about it. In 2003, Nokia had the single best-selling handset in the history of the world. It was a Nokia 1100. 2003. In 2009, they had lost 90% of their market share. And in 2011, they were sold to Microsoft. Now, what caused that? There were a couple of things. What happened in 2007? Anyone want to pop it in the chat? What happened in 2007? 2007, of course, the iPhone dropped. Now, that was a game changer for the mobile phone industry. However, for the 5 years prior to that, Nokia was the dominant player in handsets. They owned almost all of the market. It was an amazing position to be in. And yet they missed all of the signals along the way. Smartphones were already coming online when Apple dropped the iPhone. Things like the BlackBerry commitment to the keyboard is sort of legendary. Nokia had the same blind spot, by the way. I wasn't there, but I would suggest to you that many of these micro signs of misalignment probably were happening across the leadership team at Nokia. For example, I'm sure that for many, many months and many quarterly business reviews, they were showing up with a lot of green statuses when in fact they were losing market share like crazy. So in a famous final press conference, and you can look it up on YouTube or whatever, but Stephen Elp, who was the CEO, said, "We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we still lost." I would suggest to you that alignment is the key to making sure that you're not the team that says we didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we still lost. Alignment is what lets you see the opportunities between the groups in your organization and the risks that exist in the market, right? So you need to be able to respond quickly, not as an individual, but as a leadership team, or within an organization, not as a team leader, but as a team as a whole. You need to be able to respond to the things that are going on around you. And the way to do that is to have great conversations, make misalignment visible, have the conversations together, and understand the mindsets and the group dynamics that are influencing it. Don't be the team that doesn't do anything wrong, but somehow still loses. I see Rachel and Michelle, jumping in with the iPhone. So again, my colleague Nicole has just reposted the link to the PDF. If you want to have these conversations with your team, I would really encourage you to take the circumflex and use it maybe to shake up your most routine meeting where you know people want to stick pins in their eyes, right? It might just change the conversation, and you will have some fascinating discussions with your colleagues about where there might be an opportunity to get better aligned around your most ambitious goals and your biggest transformations that you're trying to undertake in your organization. So feel free to use the resource. At the same time, we would love to say hello. If you want to reach out and schedule a 30-minute complimentary conversation with us, we would be delighted to talk with you about what we've learned over the years, about how to create alignment across a group of people so that you don't miss the opportunities or the risks that exist between you. And you're not living in that happy space of everybody is green, but we're not getting where we need to go. I want to say thank you again for jumping in, and apologies as well for being a little bit late to start. Hopefully this was really helpful for you and you got some great tips out of it. And we would love again to talk with you about our 7 signs of misalignment, but also about our alignment solutions. We have alignment solutions for teams, we have them for individuals, and we have them for senior leaders and boards as well. So check us out at karrikinsgroup.com. Say hello if you get a chance, and hopefully we will talk soon. Have a great rest of your day.